So let's offer the bracha for learning Torah together, and then we'll get right into it. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. Okay, people love dead Jews. There's just so much to talk about. First, I would love to so what we're talking about today, as I mentioned in the email yesterday, is her foreword, and as well the story about Anne Frank, her essay about Harbin, and then her first take on American anti-Semitism, Pittsburgh, and the Rose Mallinger treatment that she did. So that's our overview. I wanted to just first solicit some general reactions to this book, and then we'll do a deeper dive on each of those pieces. But what are some general reactions to people love dead Jews? And it's such an evocative title. What do you think about the title? What do you think? What are some general reactions?
Hello.
Anyone?
Speaking.
Who? Okay. Paul Kalis.
Can't do it now.
I think
If everyone who's not talking can mute so that we don't hear, ambient noise. Paul Kalis?
Yeah, my initial impression is that what a sad state of affairs it is to even have a book by the name of that title. I'm a very, very upbeat person, and I'd rather hear wonderful stories about living Jews and Jews who have passed away, who have been of service to humanity. But in general, I was turned off by the title, even though I was fascinated by some of the material. I'm up to chapter 4 now.
Okay. Okay. Other reactions to the title and just in general to the first several chapters?
Go ahead.
I wanted to add mine, Marilyn.
Please.
I found it very upsetting, but compelling. And I'm extremely impressed by her knowledge. And she comes from a place that she's able to make her statements. And, I just wish it wasn't true. But I can recall, and maybe she has a chapter later on. I can remember a couple of years ago, there was a segment on a news program about Poland and how they were having an annual fair for Jews. And it was in a community where there were no Jews, and all of them had been killed. And it's the same thing, and it's crass.
How many of you have been to European cities where you've taken a tour of the Jewish aspect of that city, and it is rendered as a museum tour? We've actually seen museums of Torah scrolls or museums of tefillin, or this is what Jews used to do when they lived here. I mean, has anyone did? I've taken many of those tours. So yeah, so this is very real. Roxanne, your hand was up, but we'll take one last comment as a general response to the hard truths she brings this book.
It brings me back to when I took a tour of Andalusia, and if you're in Spain, there are actually Spain and in Italy, there are several places where there are commemorations for the Jews who died. Sometimes they're really small. You have to have someone who knows where they are to show them to you. It seems to be their way for kind of apologizing, but I think that one of her points, and something that really sticks with me, is how much there is within our own culture, these trips to places where Jews have died and learning about this tragic history. And to me, it seems like the follow-up question has to be, well, what did they have that we want to create? Because if we're constantly taking our youth and going places to feel so badly. And I did. I'm going to tell you, when I was in Italy by the Lake District, and there's a rock there, I had to actually take a picture to have someone tell me, because I couldn't make out the Hebrew enough to know what it said. But in World War II, they took the Jews that were there by the Lake District, which is just beautiful, and they threw them all in the lake. They drowned them. And I could only picture people who felt so secure in their lives, having it really quite literally, thrown away. But the question really becomes, not only do we need to commemorate, but we really need to ask, what did they have that we want to create? So there's something more positive that we walk away with than constantly mourning some of the condition of human nature.
Yeah, I know that, last week I sent you a podcast where Dara Horn was in dialogue with Yehuda Kurtzer. If it's an excellent podcast. And one of the themes of the book, to your point, Roxanne, was the disturbing nature of this conversation is that we like to think we have agency. We like to think that we're positive actors. We like to be hopeful and optimistic and that we can shape our destiny. And this whole notion of people love dead Jews, and in city after city and experience after experience, the story is that of a depressing trajectory is just cuts against the agency. It seems like there's almost an inevitability to Jewish suffering, and that undermines agency. By the way, as you know, we read the Netanyahus, and this was one of the basic themes of the Netanyahus, was that Ben-Zion Netanyahu said, it always ends the same, they always kill us. And the American historian Reuben Bloom, and also the Israeli establishment, as reflected by that letter, the recommendation. Guys, can you please mute if you're not speaking? Please mute so we don't hear ambient noise. Thank you. So that, and actually Joan or whoever's hosting, if you guys can do a universal mute, because there's still some who are not muted. Thank you. I think that tension, Roxanne, is in your comment, which is, it's very depressing to think that this is true, but it seems to be true. And in that case, what about our agency? And that was an open dispute in the Netanyahus. It seems to be one of the, and it's in the podcast, and indeed it's on our own country. I wanted to just pivot to the introduction. She tells the story of in high school, being in dialogue with these girls who were from the South, and they didn't get Jews, and they said things that were hurtful and anti-Semitic, and she's in high school and she calls her mother, and her mother says, I know. And that's one of the themes of the book, is about knowing. And I wanted to just invite anyone who could resonate to that, if you had your own experience of that kind of thing, where you encountered somebody who really doesn't get the Jewish people and looks askance at you. So anyone want to share? Maddie and Bruce.
Thank you, Wes. My sister is on this call this morning too, so she may remember the story. In 1952, my twin cousins, first generation Americans, were accepted to Wellesley College from the Yeshiva of Flatbush and Midwood High School in Brooklyn. Quite an accomplishment. They went off to Wellesley and told the story later on that in the dining hall, they were sitting at a table with some girls from the South, and the girls looked at them and said, "It's amazing how you Jewish girls can hide your horns under your cashmere sweaters." And my cousin Shash, who was the more vocal of the twins, turned to this person and said, first of all, we don't have horns. And second of all, we couldn't afford cashmere sweaters to come to Wellesley. So this was a story that was passed on in the family many times. But what I recall was just that the story was told in a very matter-of-fact way, and my aunt and uncle just kind of accepted it as a fact of life. And that was really, I think that was the same thing that Dara Horn experienced with her mom, who just said, it is what it is.
I
She
know.
wasn't surprised at all.
Yeah, thank you, Maddie. Right, and that introduction and that story is accessible and helpful because it makes it real. This is not just about what's happening in Amsterdam or what's happened in Harbin in Manchuria, but it happens to us in our own lives. Wendy, your hand was up. Did you have a comparable story?
So this was in 1980 in New York, where I thought, kind of, there were lots of Jews. And even though we were completely secular, it was high school. We were on a bus to an outward bound type activity in the Adirondacks from Manhattan. It was a small all girls prep school. And on the bus, I was asked, are you Jewish? I was new. And I will never forget hesitating at 14. What do I say? I knew I couldn't say no, but I just had the sense that things would be different after 3 weeks. I had signed up to sleep in a tent. I threw my sleeping bag in the tent that I had borrowed from the Rabbi's son at the youth group that I went to. And they threw the sleeping bag out of the tent and said, there's no room for you here, and never spoke to me again over 4 years. And that wasn't so long ago.
Wow. Wendy, with that kind of a story in your background, how do you experience these chapters that you're reading in this book?
So, it has impacted my life. I remember at 14 saying, when I have kids, I was upset that I hesitated and thought about, what do I say? And I said, I'm going to raise children that never think about it, that just say, yep, I'm Jewish. And I read those chapters and they resonate with me because every time we go places from Finland to Europe, we always go to Jewish places. And whoever was speaking and talking about Spain, that resonates with me. And I think I look at this on the one hand saying this is true, and on the other hand getting angry, and it kind of claws at me because I do want agency. I want us to think that we can change things, but I think what I realized is that as we go and we see all of these sites that people dedicate to Jews, I am always surprised that people, mankind, they haven't learned. Prague stands out to me most of all. You would think that society has learned, and they still don't understand.
So let me pivot off of that to the Anne Frank chapter. I want to just start with this line that, she, as you know, she mentions the story of a young man with a kippah who was told he had to hide his Jewish identity. And she has this line that it was the museum. Let's see. When a young employee at the Anne Frank house tried to wear his yarmulke to work, his employers told him to hide it under a baseball cap. The museum's goal was neutrality, in quotes, one spokesperson explained to the British newspaper Daily Mail. And a live Jew in a yarmulke might interfere with the museum's independent position. The museum finally relented after deliberating for 4 months, which seems like a rather long time for the Anne Frank house to ponder whether it was a good idea to force a Jew into hiding. What was your reaction to this Anne Frank chapter? Her basic point being that Anne Frank is so popular because she's a hidden Jew, she's a dead Jew, and then of course she gives everybody a free pass. She gives very Jesus-y absolution. I still believe that everybody is good, even when she's killed a few weeks later by people who are not good. And then the contrast that Dara Horn brings in is that is the man who died in Auschwitz, and he took people from the gas chambers to the crematoria after getting gold out of their teeth. And he writes about this, about the crematoria and about the gas chambers and about the gold and the teeth. And he writes about it, and nobody has any interest in reading the writings of this guy, Zalman Gradowski, because Zalman Gradowski asked the world to actually confront what happened. But Anne Frank's book, which doesn't actually go there and gives people a pass at the end, she's plus she's dead, plus she never got to live. All of that makes her super popular. What did you think of her chapter on Anne Frank? Any thoughts? Maddie.
Let me unmute. I have a question. What I was surprised, I thought that the Anne Frank book we read was her actual diary. I had no idea that it was doctored or that it was edited in any way. And that was the implication in this, that it was homogenized to be read so that it would be a popular book. Does anybody have any information about that?
What I read her saying, Maddie, was just, I just know what I read I've been to the Anne Frank house actually, and I only know what I've read that Dara Horn wrote, but that Anne Frank herself edited her own book. I mean, her Dara Horn's presentation of Anne Frank is that she was super literate and articulate and intentional about writing, and that she wrote that the work that we read is an edited work by a very thoughtful teenage editor. That's what I heard her say.
She edited herself. She edited herself.
She edited herself.
She didn't make that.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
But the basic claim that she write, the treatment that she says, the line most often quoted from the Frank's diary are her famous words, "I still believe in spite of everything that people are really good at heart." And then she writes, these words are inspiring, by which people mean that they flatter us. They make us feel forgiven for those lapses of our civilization that allow for piles of murdered girls. And if those words came from a murdered girl, well, then we must be absolved because they must be true. That gift of grace and absolution from a murdered Jew, exactly the gift that lies at the heart of Christianity, is what millions of people are so eager to find in Frank's hiding place. And then she says, Frank wrote about people being truly good at heart before meeting people who weren't. 3 weeks after writing those words, she met people who weren't. So it's a very sober-eyed view of Anne Frank. What do you guys think? And what does, and to this point about, agency that Wendy mentioned, that Roxanne mentioned, that Yehuda Kurtzer talked about with Dara Horn in the podcast, what is the agency response to reading this sober chapter? Any takers?
Oh, that's good. Okay, hold on.
And if I'm missing you, feel free to put your voice in your name in the chat function, and I'll be happy to call on anyone. So did
Okay.
yeah, anybody?
Okay, bye.
Okay, well, I want to just say, I thought, to me, this book is really important. She really got me, not only with her story, but this presentation of Anne Frank and the contrast between Anne Frank and Zalman Gradowski, and the fact that one, everybody's read, and one, nobody's ever heard of before they read this book. I thought that was very telling. Very telling. It kind of makes the case about the title, which is hard to hear, but it seems true. Anyone have a kind of, does anyone think she's off? Does anyone think, she's unduly cynical? Does anyone think she's off here? David Kopelman, do you think she's off here?
No,
And now you're muted again, David. Yes.
am I okay now?
Now you're good. Yeah.
No, I don't think she's cynical at all. I think she tells it like it is, although I might somewhat quarrel with her title that people love dead Jews. It seems that there are many news accounts of Jewish cemeteries being desecrated throughout Europe and Germany, Austria, France, Eastern Europe. Even in her book, she mentions that in Doran, Harbin rather, that these porcelain images of Jews on gravestones were smashed. So even when the Jews are dead, they don't gain respect or love. They're still persecuted even after they've perished. So I don't know.
Yeah. So I want to, this is not only a book group, but it's also a, you're in a synagogue and with a rabbi. So I want to bring a little Torah in. Joni, can you screen share the text I gave you? Joni, yeah, great, thank you. So I wanted to ask you to think about the reality she talks about, and David, you're even more sober than her title. She says people love dead Jews, living Jews not so much. And you say people love dead Jews not so much, even dead Jews, because they desecrate Jewish cemeteries, which is of course true. And all of this horribleness, and all of this depressingness, and all of this sadness, how do you square this with God's message at the beginning of the Jewish story, which is Genesis 12? I'll make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, God says to Abraham, and I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and curse him that curses you. And all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you. So the promise, okay, Joan, you can take that off now. Thank you, Joni. The promise of our Torah is that we're going to be a blessing, and that the nations of the world are going to be blessed by us. And the reality seems to be different from that. How do you square the covenantal promise in the Torah with the sober reality that Dara Horn describes? What do you do with that? Paul, Kailas.
I agree with what David said and what you just said, but there is another side to this, in that I believe the Jews as a group are admired for their successes in medicine, successes in dentistry, successes in business, successes in philanthropy.
Right.
How many times have you heard I go to a Jewish doctor because I trust them? So there is a great deal of trust in some Jews, but I don't know how to explain this antipathy for the other Jews. I've read many books on anti-Semitism, and I still don't get it.
Okay, thank you. Let me call on Karen. Karen, I'm sorry I didn't see your hand. I appreciate you putting your note in the chat. That's how you need to do to get noticed if I inadvertently miss you. So Karen, you're up.
Okay, two things. One is this book I think is really astute, and it was very, very upsetting also. Just disarming. A lot of it twisted, made me see a lot of things differently than I had. Things that wasn't uncomfortable with Anne Frank, but just the Jewish sites in Europe. I always just wondered about them, and I just thought that it was frightening but astute. Even to the idea of bringing Jewish tourist money into these countries as a motivation. And the other thing is about the cursing and the blessing is that I just heard Andrea Levin interview Ruth Weiss, who said that, societies that are anti-Semitic end up failing. And it's not because Jews are necessarily so wonderful, but it's just that our enemies are so horrible.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, so that you could say that Jewish history somewhat buttresses God's promise, which is, Nazi Germany is no more. The 1,000-year Reich was 12 years. And that America, that's been good to the Jews for all of our problems, is still thriving in its own way. We're trying to get better. So that is a move. But I will say, one of the at least in the first 4 chapters, she has not yet really tackled, to me, a foundational question, which is why. And and yeah, maybe it's a Christian problem. Thank you, Nina. Anti-Semitism is a Christian problem, but it is also our problem if we're the ones gunned down at shul. So it is also our problem, and it's just kind of hard to figure out where it comes from, and that's important because that could help us try to figure out what to do about it. I want to go to the Harbin chapter, which was just so interesting. I mean, who even knew about it? And I wanted to get some reactions on this chapter about the Jews in Manchuria, the Jews who built this frozen city, the city in this frozen tundra, and were, to a person, kidnapped, stolen from, murdered, and I mean, I didn't know anything about it until we read it. What was your reaction to this chapter about Harbin? And also very artful about how she brings in the tigers that are kind of like the Jews, a big exhibit, and then the frozen ice sculptures that are here today and gone tomorrow, kind of like Harbin itself. What was your reaction to that chapter? Anybody want to share their thoughts? One of the themes of this is that is this idea that on page 28 that there's 27, 28, most Chinese people know next to nothing about Jews or Judaism. But in a 2009 essay reviewing trends in Jewish studies in China, Li Hong-song, a professor of Jewish studies at Nanjing University, pointed out a common pattern in what they do know. My students' first association with Jews is that they are rich and smart, he noted. The shelves of Chinese bookstores, Song explained, are lined with bestsellers on Jewish subjects. What Jewish subjects might those be? Well, some of these best-selling titles are Unveiling the Secrets of Jewish Success in the World Economy, What's Behind Jewish Excellence, The Financial Empire of the Rothschilds, Talmudic Wisdom in Conducting Business, and of course, Talmud, the greatest Jewish Bible for making money. Hence the popularity. What do you do with that? I mean, what do you do with that? And what is the, reading this invites the question, what do you do about it? And I think that's one of the big questions that Dara Horn leaves for us, the readers, to marinate on is, what do you do with this? Does this mean you do want to go to China? Does this mean you don't want to go to China? Does this mean that the next time you travel, you're going to travel straight to Israel and only to Israel? What is the response of you to the reality she describes? And if you read the story, it's just horrifying. I mean, she tells the story of this guy, Caspi, who creates this gorgeous hotel that is, Joseph Caspi, the modern hotel, and it's a whole brand. And he's 100 years ahead of the rest of the world in terms of branding and marketing. And then his son is kidnapped and they chop off his ear, and then he's killed, and he sees the body of his mutilated son and he goes crazy, and his wife is killed at Auschwitz and one child survives. Yuck, yuck. And that's like, some version of that is in every family of Harbin. they invest their money and then they're kidnapped and massacred and murdered and their money is looted. Those are the Jewish people. Like, what do you do with that? And how do you react to that? How do you react to that? Would love some voices on this. David.
Well, it does echo the thoughts in that book about Netanyahu, that sooner or later, no matter how prosperous or comfortable Jews may feel in their country that they've escaped to, sooner or later, doom will be their destiny. So it does echo that. Well, on that same page 28, another interesting remark, the mayor of Harbin gives a speech and he says that the world's money is in the pockets of the Americans, and the Americans' money is in the pockets of the Jews. And
Right.
that's old, although he probably meant to be complimentary, it's an old anti-Semitic trope, and it exists today. In 2012, Representative Ilhan Omar from Minnesota made that remark that's similar. It's all about the Benjamins, baby, a reference to Jewish money influencing Washington.
Right.
And her similar remark at a Washington bookstore accusing Jews of harboring dual loyalty, that is being more loyal to Israel than America, another anti-Semitic trope. And I wonder if you consider this, if a congressman made a comparable remark that African Americans have a greater loyalty to Africa than to America, how long would they last on the Foreign Relations Committee? And yet, Ilhan Omar and some of these, Rashida Tlaib, will make these anti-Semitic tropes without consequence. I mean, anti-Semitism apparently is fair game. There are no consequences. Neither of these people were removed from the Foreign Relations Committee because it's okay to make an anti-Semitic remark about Jews. Well, they're from a, you euphemize it. They're from a different culture. You have to understand that. You have to understand that.
Right.
I think it's time for American Jews to stand up and call it out and not worry about being politically correct and call out anti-Semitism. If it's in the BLM movement, if it's in the BDS movement, Ilhan Omar, call it out.
Thank you. So I want to just note, I want to call a timeout, and I just want to observe a quality about this class session today, which is the relative silence, the relative quiet, the relative reticence, the relative reluctance of people to speak. Are we frozen? Are you frozen? Can you hear me? Joan, are we frozen?
No.
We're not frozen. Okay. And I wanted to, in her chapter about the frozen Jews, she tells the story of that we've talked about this before. The Diaspora Museum, formerly the Diaspora Museum in Tel Aviv, told these depressing stories about Jews go to all these different places in the world. They are invited in, they become successful, they build it up, they create culture and buildings and science and medicine, and it always ends badly and they always die and get kicked out. And that was the Diaspora Museum. And she talks about it as a dark and dour place, much like this conversation is dark and dour, much like this book is dark and dour. And then she says that the museum got retooled from the Diaspora Museum to the Museum of the Jewish People. It's called Anu now, not Beit HaTfutzot. And it's very cheery, happy. And there's no residue of they hate us. What country did we get kicked out of this week? And it's now just a happy, positive story. And my question to you is, what do you think of that approach? In other words, is it a positive thing? Do we want to be teaching this book to our children? Is it required reading for our kids, for our high schoolers to know this? Do you want your kids to know the story of Harbin? Do you want your kids to know that, this year, a Jew working in the Anne Frank house was told to wear a kippah so that his Jewish identity would not be revealed? Do you want that out? And or do you want to say, let's be like the current museum in Israel. Let's not talk about all the hard stories. Let's talk about the happy things in the Jewish people. And I want to say that that is an ongoing dialectic that, even in my own lifetime, and I've been, rabbi for 25 years, when I was trained at the seminary, when I first came out, I was trained not to talk about anti-Semitism. It's just a downer. It's just a downer. Don't talk about it. And it's kind of not relevant anymore. And talk about Shabbos, and talk about the mitzvah, and talk about justice, and talk about tikkun olam. Don't talk about the Jews. What country were we kicked out of last week? What are your thoughts about? And from this reluctance of this class, I'm sensing that those multitudes still exist. That tension still exists within your hearts. Charlene Finkel.
Okay. Full disclosure, I'm being quiet because I haven't read the book. So it may be that there are some other people who haven't, but I still feel I can participate with two things. Number one, when God says a great nation, I think that's happened. I think the Jewish contribution to the world, percentage-wise, is just outstanding, and probably no other religion can compare to it. So I would agree with the first part of the blessing. Second, I think it's extremely important for our children to deal with reality. It's been so far since the Holocaust. Some of us are of the age that either we lived through it, like our wonderful Hannah, or it's close to us. But it was so many years ago that our generation does not relate to it at all. I was just reading this book about the Commando family in Paris. Many of you may have gone to the museum, and this family donated the museum before World War II. And then with World War II, the whole family that was alive, except for one, went to Auschwitz and was killed. So I just think it's very important for our kids to know the reality. And then what do we do with it? But to deny it, I feel is very wrong.
Mm-hmm. By the way, Charlene, I was at that museum, and I was there, and here's what's shocking about that museum, and it connects with this book. I think for next week, I'll scan and send these chapters so that everybody has them. We're reading from the same hymnal. But one of the things that she points out is that these so-called Jewish heritage sites, where they say Jews used to live here, they never talk about why they no longer live here. Like, they tell the story that Jews used to live here, and they don't ever tell the story of why Jews no longer live here, which is they were murdered, massacred, expelled, jailed, kidnapped, and tortured. They never tell that story.
Mhm.
It's just like, voila, suddenly, right? At that museum that you're mentioning, I remember Shir and I were there with our kids, and the entire museum is beautiful house in France, and this is how this family used to live, and this was their dining room, and this and this and this and this and this. And all the while you're wondering, why is it a museum? What happened to this family? What happened to this family? And then when you get to the top floor, there's one little sheet that's this big that you have to look at to find, which says, by the way, the family was all sent to Auschwitz where they died. This much at the very end. Otherwise, you would never even know.
Yeah.
So one of the things that this book is doing is it is really giving voice to this reality. I want to move to the Pittsburgh piece. I thought of all the chapters, this one to me was just particularly poignant because I'll sum up a little bit for those who didn't read it. She begins with the refrain, "There are no words," which was so real. I mean, that was just 3 years ago. There are no words. There are no words. And then she points out, she's such a brilliant writer. She's such a brilliant writer that in fact, there are a lot of words on it. We say there are no words, but there are a lot of words. And the words that there are the words in our Siddur and the words in our sacred canon that Jews actually recite. So the words that actually take in what happened in Pittsburgh that morning are the words of our religious tradition that the Jews were reciting that morning. And it's the Purim story, it's the Pesach story, it's the Hanukkah story, it's the story of Jewish history. And then what she said, and this was so, I just found myself like she saw me and she got me, that American Jews felt that, so I'm going to read this. She tells the story through Rose Mallinger, who was 97. So this 97-year-old woman was murdered on that day. And she says, people of Ms. Mallinger's age were in their 20s when word spread about mass murders of Jews in Europe. In synagogues on Rosh Hashanah, they read the old words begging God for compassion for the sake of those killed for your holy name, and for the sake of those slaughtered for your uniqueness. Then she writes, my husband's grandparents came here after those massacres, their previous spouses and children slaughtered like the people in the prayer. They kept reciting the prayer, and for their new American family, it reverted to metaphor, which is so powerful. That and that kind of, right, that this was ancient Jewish history, it's not American history. Dead Jews is ancient Jewish history, dead Jews is Europe, dead Jews is Babylon, dead Jews is Rome, dead Jews is Nazi Germany, dead Jews is Kishinev and the Pale Settlement. Dead Jews is not America, right? And it's metaphor. And then it's not metaphor. And then she writes, in 2001, after terrorists attacked American cities, concrete barriers sprouted in front of my family's synagogue, police cruisers parked in the lot. This felt practical in a nation on edge. We assumed it affected everyone. As my children were born and grew, the barriers and guards became their normal. When I took my children to an interfaith Thanksgiving service at a church down the street from our synagogue, one of them asked me why no one was guarding the church's door. And then she just deals with the reality that we now have security and guards, etc. So that what used to be metaphor is now not metaphor anymore. And she tells that entire story through a 97-year-old woman who was slaughtered that morning. What is your reaction to the Pittsburgh chapter? And again, what does it make you want to do? How do you want to act in response to it? Ellen, please.
The Pittsburgh chapter certainly brought to the forefront what's going on in America and around the world. And if anybody wanted to delude themselves, I'm sorry, there's construction.
No worries.
Reading that chapter makes it clear. And really, you asked the question, is it important? There was silence in the group here, and why? Is it that people don't agree with the book? And I want to say that I very much think that this book should be read and the concept should be spread. And I had our children read it. They're reading it, and their children are going to read it. Because our kids are going to colleges and they're not prepared. Perhaps it's not discussed at home. I don't know. But anti-Semitism is alive and well in Pittsburgh. Is proof.
Right. One of the other things, Helen, I think you speak about college kids, one of the other tropes that she names is, oh, I'm anti-Israel, I'm not anti-Semitic. I'm anti-Zionist, I'm not anti-Semitic. And anti-Semitism equals anti-Zionism, anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism. I don't agree that there should be a Jewish state equals I don't agree there should be a Jewish people. And so she calls that out. And when our kids go to college, there's, you've all heard stories about our good-hearted, liberal, progressive kids who are kicked out of their climate, the climate group or this progressive cause or, racial justice cause or sexual justice cause or LGBTQ or the environment or whatever it is. They're kicked out because they're Jewish, and they're kicked out because they support Israel. And that's the world that our kids are inheriting in real time today. in 2021. So I guess I wanna bring back this theme of agency, because one of the, I happen to agree, Ellen, I think it's required reading. I told my family that I would love them all to read this book. I thought that in the same way, last year we read Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, and I couldn't look at America the same way, or American history. To me, this book is as transformational and pivotal as Caste. I can't look at the world and the world story and the Jewish story the same way after reading this book. And my question is, and I don't have an answer, but I want to plant the question, it's possible to just read this book and therefore, if you accept that it's true, be depressed. And therefore, if you accept it's true, just never leave your Jewish space, and therefore just live all your life in the synagogue or your Jewish space that you're comfortable with and never get out, etc. And I guess my question is, how do we resist that response? And how do we have an agency response where we exert our power and our agency to resist this and to better the world? I don't have the answer, but to me, that is a very pivotal question. Roxanne.
So I have many thoughts about that. I mean, I can't take away the depressing part of it, but I think that I think there are many aspects. I mean, I even think about Echa, and I think about how we observe Tisha B'Av. And yet I think in the destruction of the temple and the exile of the Jews, what came out of that was the Talmudic period. And that's what's really helped Judaism thrive. There is such an emphasis on the tragedy and the tragic things that have happened that we don't end up posing the challenges or the things that we have grown from it, which is not to deny the tragedies that have happened. They all have to be taught. But if that's the emphasis of what I've taught, my brother said to me one day, no one's going to want to be Jewish. I mean, so to me, there also needs to be a next step. You know, the Holocaust is like a pinnacle of horror. And yet it has challenged us, I think it's challenged the Jewish people to really have to think about God differently. Whether that's good or not, I don't know, but I think it's absolutely been pivotal about what's happened, among other things from the Holocaust. The destruction of the temple absolutely led to a growth of the Jewish people. So I think we have a tendency to focus on the tragic and not also look at the flip of where has it taken us? Right. Beyond commemoration, beyond mourning, where else has it taken us?
Right.
In terms of other things, like I'm going to tell you, when we were in Prague, we signed up for a small group architectural tour to one of the small towns. There were two other couples who knew each other who went, and there was room for us in the van. And when we got to that town, it was past time for lunch, and the guide, who himself was a minority, he was a mix of, I think, his father was African, his mother was European in some way, but he was very dark-skinned. He was definitely a minority in the area. And he stopped at one of these really small bar type places because he wanted to avoid the crowds, and he read the menu. Well, it was very small, so the menu was all pork. And I said, you know, there's nothing here that I can eat. I'll really appreciate it if we keep looking. And he just stared at me and he said, "You're Jewish?" And I said, "Yes." And he jumped because I didn't fit his stereotype of what a Jew would be. And that was really interesting. It was a very interesting moment for me of the importance of actually interacting with people. But in terms of the gentleman who said, you know, in the Democratic Party itself, it's acceptable to be anti-Israel, to be anti-this. And I look back at my youth, and in my experience growing up in Minnesota is we got really active in the synagogue, and we used it as a means of social action. And when there was a lot of anti-Israel stuff coming out of the UN and this and that and the other things, and we all got together and we got the rabbis from all the conservative synagogues to come out with something that could be sent at the time, you know, before the internet, in telegrams to Senator Mondale, saying what
Right.
position we wanted him to take. So what the rabbis did is came out the wording, and we all called the congregation. And out of that, he actually called the rabbis because he wasn't accustomed to that kind of unified response. And he realized there really was something going on that he had to understand. We have a senator, and her name is Warren, who, in my opinion, doesn't tend to stand very well with Israel. And I just think it's such a waste. We have a very strong Jewish community here, and I don't think we use our social action well in terms of really speaking up. And I think we could do a lot better. I don't think we need to just have discussions. I don't think we just need to write letters to the editor. I actually think that we could use a lot more agency as a group and as a community.
Well, Roxanne, your story from the 70s feels like 1,000 years ago.
No kidding.
It's 10,000 years ago, because even the Jewish world, the synagogue world, which is the only world I really know, is just so different now.
Yes, we're
And-
not unified.
We're so not unified. You know, when Pittsburgh happened 3 years ago, Elizabeth Warren called me to say she wants to come and offer support to the Jewish community. One of the conversations we've had, David Kopelman has been making this point, is that this is not Europe, because in Europe it was the leaders who hated the Jews. And in America, the leaders don't hate the Jews. The leadership of our elected leaders support the Jews. So I thought, you know, that was true and is true, and how cool it would be to have, and helpful to have, Elizabeth Warren. She called me. She wants to read a prayer for the country and state her support for the Jewish people. And I got real hate mail from Temple Emmanuel members. I got the kind of hate mail with the kind of ray lines that would have been appropriate if I was a pedophile abusing children. Shame on you. Shame on you. One person wrote me an email and said, shame on you that you're having Elizabeth Warren. So I changed the ray line to Shabbat Shalom. And they wrote back, shame on you. You know, there's just so much bile that even having Elizabeth Warren speak in support of the Jewish people and against anti-Semitism, and as a gesture of support, was so incredibly incendiary. So your comment, your story about 50 years ago in Minneapolis is just 1,000 years ago. We could not, any kind of statement about anything would just be so fractious and contentious. That's part of the I mean, I have an incredible problem with the fact that when Iron Dome was overwhelmingly supported by 420 votes, there were a number of the so-called progressive Congress people that opposed it, or AOC, didn't take a position. That's entirely a defensive system that would try to prevent dead Jews. But these Congress people like dead Jews. They're not opposed to dead Jews, and they don't want to reinstate a weapon system that will prevent dead Jews. And so they opposed it or were neutral towards it, like AOC. You could not even get the Jewish people to make a statement against that, because there's so many young Jews who, no matter what AOC does, she can do no wrong. So it's just a completely different world that we live in. All I want to say is thank you for that. It's a really revealing counter narrative of a world that is very distant from our own world, where that kind of unified action was possible. And I want to just leave you with the question about reading this. I think this book is very important. We can't just be depressed about it. This has to empower us somehow to act. But given all the complexities that we inhabit, including division, deep division within our own world, what does that agency look like? So let me leave that as a meta question to have you look at. And then if you will read the next 3 chapters, which is chapters 4, 5, and 6 for next week, I will send out a scanned version of those 3 chapters, and we'll pick this up next week. sober, important, and it leaves us with the question, what do we do about it? So thank you, guys. See you next week for chapters 4, 5, and 6. Thank you. Bye.